Imagine it's 9:00 p.m. You're alone, the house is silent, and suddenly four firm knocks echo through your hallway. You aren't expecting anyone. You look through the peephole and see a man with a package, but the name on the box isn't yours. You think it's a simple mistake, but then he comes back the next night, and the night after that. Soon the box disappears and he's just standing there in the dark, staring at your door. I thought it was a delivery error, but the police told me the terrifying truth. He wasn't looking for a signature. He was marking my house, tracking my movements, and waiting for the exact moment the lights went out to force his way in. I was living alone in a small, weathered rental house just on the outskirts of town when this nightmare began to unfold. It was a modest, one-story place tucked away at the very end of a short, dead-end road. There were only 5 houses on the entire street, and because it was a cul-de-sac, we almost never saw a car that didn't belong to a neighbor. At night, the silence was so heavy it felt physical. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant my life was mostly lived within those 4 walls. I was a bit of a recluse, rarely leaving unless I needed groceries. My friends knew my habits well. They never showed up unannounced and always texted or called before even driving over. That is why on that particular Thursday night around 8:45 p.m., the sound of 4 firm, rhythmic knocks on my front door felt like a jump scare. I was sitting in the living room, the only light coming from the flickering blue glow of the TV. I froze, my hand hovering over the remote to mute the volume. I sat perfectly still, heart hammering against my ribs, wondering if I had simply imagined the sound. Then 2 more knocks followed, sharper and more insistent this time. I stood up, my floorboards creaking under my weight, and crept toward the door. I looked through the tiny, distorted lens of the peephole. A man was standing on my porch. He looked perfectly ordinary, mid-30s, wearing a dark utility jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. In his arms, he cradled a medium-sized cardboard box. I opened the door just a few inches, keeping the heavy security chain firmly engaged. He didn't look up at first. His eyes were fixed on a small handheld electronic device. He told me he had a delivery that required a signature and read a name off the screen. It wasn't my name. It wasn't even close. I explained that he had the wrong house, but he didn't apologize and leave. Instead, he looked at the box, then back at his device, and then directly at me. He read my exact street address out loud, questioning me as if I were the one who was lost. I repeated that no one by that name lived there. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, a blank, cold expression that made the hair on my arms stand up. Finally, he mumbled something about a mistake and walked down the driveway. I watched from the window, expecting to see a delivery truck with flashing lights, but the street was empty. He simply walked past my mailbox and vanished into the darkness of the woods at the end of the road. The next night, the dread returned. At almost the exact same time, 8:45 p.m., those same 3 knocks echoed through the house. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I didn't even consider opening the door this time. I went straight to the peephole. It was him again, the same jacket, the same cap, and the same cardboard box. I spoke through the heavy wood of the door, my voice trembling, telling him that he had already been here and that he needed to leave. There was a long, suffocating silence. He finally spoke, his voice calm and monotone, saying the system required a signature tonight or the package would be discarded. I refused again. I watched him through the peephole for 5 minutes. He didn't leave immediately. He stood at the edge of my porch, slowly turning his head to inspect the seals on my windows and the shadows of my backyard before finally retreating into the night. By the 4th night, the psychological pressure was reaching a breaking point. I was in the kitchen washing dishes, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid when I heard a new sound. 4 knocks, but they weren't at the front door. They were sharp, metallic raps against the glass of my dining room window on the side of the house. I spun around, the water still running, but the backyard was a black void. Seconds later, the front door knocking started again. I crept to the hallway and looked out. It was him, but this time his hands were empty. No box, no scanner. He was just standing there, staring directly into the peephole as if he could see me trembling on the other side. I backed away into the kitchen and sat on the floor in the dark, waiting. Later, I peeked through the blinds and saw him standing across the street, perfectly still near the tree line, just watching my house. I called the police the following morning, and the conversation I had with the officer changed everything. He told me that this wasn't a lost delivery driver, it was a professional casing tactic. Burglars use fake packages to verify occupancy. If you answer, they mark the house as occupied. If you don't answer several nights in a row, they assume you're away on vacation and they move in for a full-scale robbery. But this man was doing something different. He wasn't just checking if I was home, he was learning my schedule. He was watching when the lights went out and which doors I used. That final night, I decided to play a dangerous game. I turned off every light in the house and hid in my bedroom with my phone in my hand. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the knocks came. 4 loud, aggressive bangs on the front door. I stayed silent, holding my breath. Then came the sound I will never forget, a soft, heavy thud against the back of the house. I crept into the hallway and heard the back doorknob turning. It turned slowly to the left, stopped, and then jerked violently to the right. I whispered to the 911 dispatcher that someone was breaking in. As I spoke, I heard the sound of a crowbar or a heavy screwdriver scraping against the wooden door frame, splintering the wood as they tried to pry the bolt open. The police arrived with their sirens off, catching the intruders by surprise. They found 2 men at my back door and the delivery man waiting by the front. They found a car hidden 2 blocks away filled with empty boxes and housebreaking tools. The man admitted to the detectives that he had been watching me for a week. He knew I was alone. He knew exactly which door had the weakest lock. If I hadn't been home to call the police at that exact moment, they would have been inside my bedroom within minutes. I moved out of that house 3 months later, but the sound of an unexpected knock still sends a chill down my spine. I realized that night that a locked door is only a suggestion to someone who has been watching you from the dark. This incident took place a few years ago when I was living in a remote, windswept part of Scotland. It was the peak of winter, and the landscape was buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white snow. I was staying in an old, stone-built house that had been in my family for generations, a place that felt cozy during the day but grew cold and haunting as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. At that latitude, darkness claimed the world by 4:00 p.m., leaving long, hollow hours of night. My family had gone into the city for a few days to visit relatives, leaving me entirely alone in the vast, silent house. The only sound for miles was the low whistle of the wind through the eaves and the occasional heavy thud of snow sliding off the slate roof. It was 2 nights before Christmas, around 2:00 a.m. I was in my upstairs bedroom, huddled under a thick duvet, working on my laptop. The rest of the house was pitch black and silent. Suddenly, a sound erupted from downstairs that made my blood turn to ice. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks echoed through the hallway. Thud, thud, thud. They weren't the frantic knocks of someone in an emergency, nor were they the polite taps of a neighbor. They were rhythmic, slow, and incredibly loud in the dead silence of the night. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat frozen, staring at the bedroom door. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or perhaps a stray branch hitting the wood, but deep down I knew the difference. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept downstairs, the wooden steps groaning under my feet like they were screaming a warning. I reached the front door and looked through the tiny glass pane. Outside, the porch light illuminated the falling snow, but the porch itself was empty. There was no one there. I felt a brief wave of relief, thinking it must have been the wind, until I looked down at the ground. My breath hitched in my throat. There, in the fresh, undisturbed snow on my porch, were 2 perfectly clear footprints. They weren't from boots or shoes, they were the marks of bare human feet. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Who would be walking barefoot in sub-zero temperatures in the middle of a Scottish winter? I checked the locks twice and retreated to my room, locking the bedroom door behind me. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then it started again, but this time it wasn't the front door. A loud, sharp bang hit the kitchen window, followed by the sound of something metallic scraping against the glass. I ran to the landing and looked out toward the back garden. In the distance, standing near a gnarled old oak tree, I saw a figure. The man was tall and unnaturally thin. He was wearing tattered, filthy clothes that looked like rags, but on his head sat a bright red plush Santa hat. The contrast was sickening. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring directly up at my window. In his hand, he held a heavy brass bell. When he realized I had seen him, he didn't run. Instead, he raised the bell and began to ring it, a slow morning toll that echoed through the empty valley. Then, with terrifying speed, he sprinted toward the house. Seconds later, the knocking returned, but now it was everywhere. It was on the front door, the back door, and the downstairs windows all at once. It sounded like a dozen hands were clawing at the house, trying to find a single point of weakness. I called the police, my voice shaking so hard I could barely give my address. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, huddled in the corner of my room, listening to that rhythmic, maddening knocking continue for what felt like hours. When the police finally arrived, the knocking had stopped. They searched the perimeter with high-powered spotlights and found dozens of barefoot tracks circling the entire house, leading up to every single window and door. The tracks eventually led away toward the woods, but they vanished near a frozen stream. One of the officers told me that a man had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility a few days prior. He suffered from a severe delusion that he was a Christmas spirit tasked with entering homes to deliver justice. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, I went outside to inspect the damage. On my front porch, placed exactly where the first knocks had occurred, was a gift-wrapped box. My hands shook as I tore away the paper. Inside was a rusted, jagged kitchen knife. Carved into the wooden handle in crude, shaky letters was my own name. I didn't stay in that house another night. To this day, the sound of a bell or a knock at the door during December sends me into a state of pure panic. I learned that year that some visitors don't come for the holidays, they come for you. I was serving as a Mormon missionary in a small, isolated town during one of the harshest winters I had ever experienced. The town was the kind of place where the wind didn't just blow. It howled through the empty streets, and the silence of the snow-covered nights was so absolute it felt heavy. My companion and I lived in a cramped, drafty apartment on the edge of town that the church had rented for us. It was an old, weathered building with thin walls and floorboards that groaned under the slightest weight. Our lives were governed by a strict routine. We had to be inside with the doors locked by 9:00 p.m. every night, preparing for the next day of service in total isolation. It was a Tuesday night around 10:30 p.m. A fresh layer of thick, powdery snow had buried the world outside, and the temperature had plummeted well below freezing. My companion had already turned in for the night, but I was lingering in the small, dimly lit kitchen, finishing a glass of water. The only light came from a single overhead bulb, which turned the black window over the sink into a perfect mirror. Because of the reflection, I could see myself clearly, but the backyard was a wall of impenetrable darkness. Suddenly, a sharp, violent thwack hit the glass right in front of my face. It wasn't the sound of a stray branch or a bird, it was the unmistakable sound of a heavy human palm slamming against the pane. I froze, the glass of water trembling in my hand. I stared at my own reflection, paralyzed by the terrifying realization that while I couldn't see out, someone was standing just inches away in the dark, staring directly at me. I reached over and flicked off the kitchen light, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder, but the yard remained a shifting void of shadows and falling snow. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, but as I retreated to my bedroom, 3 slow, rhythmic knocks echoed from the front door. These weren't the knocks of someone seeking help, they were deliberate, measured, and cold. I lay in bed, heart hammering against my ribs, listening to my companion's steady breathing and hoping the sound would stop. It didn't. The knocking began to migrate. It moved from the front door to the side of the house, and then a loud, bone-chilling bang erupted against my bedroom window right above my head. I bolted out of bed and woke my companion. We grabbed our heavy-duty flashlights and stood in the hallway, whispering in the dark, terrified of what was circling our home. We decided to check the perimeter from the safety of the living room. As we approached the sliding glass door, a faint, rhythmic tapping started, a sound like a long fingernail clicking slowly against the glass. Summoning every bit of courage we had, we unlocked the door and swung our flashlights into the yard. The beams of light cut through the swirling snow, revealing nothing but empty space. However, when we looked down at the porch, our blood turned to ice. There in the pristine white snow was a single set of barefoot prints. They led directly up to the door, circled the entire apartment, and stopped right underneath my bedroom window. The most terrifying detail was that there were no exit prints. According to the tracks, whoever was out there had walked up to the house, but they had never walked away. We spent the rest of that night sitting back to back in the center of the living room, every light in the apartment blazing, clutching anything we could use as a weapon. We checked with the other missionaries the next morning, but everyone had been accounted for and stayed miles away due to the storm. No one in the neighborhood had seen a soul. To this day, the part that haunts me isn't the knocking or the tracks. It's the memory of standing in that kitchen, looking at my own reflection, knowing that someone was standing in the freezing cold, barefoot, watching me through the glass and waiting for the lights to go out. Whoever they were, they didn't want to come in, they just wanted me to know they were there. This happened during my final year of college when I was living in a small, rented apartment in an older, decaying part of the city. The building was a massive, gray structure with narrow corridors that always smelled of damp wood and old dust. My apartment was located on the 3rd floor, and the only way to reach it was by climbing a set of rusted iron stairs that shrieked under every footstep. Because I was a student, I was used to staying up late to finish projects, so being awake at 3:00 a.m. was a normal routine for me. The neighborhood was known for having strange characters wandering around at night, but I always felt safe behind my double-locked heavy oak door. I lived under the illusion that being on the 3rd floor made me unreachable, an illusion that was shattered on one terrifying Tuesday night. The clock had just struck 3:15 a.m. and the building was deathly silent. I was hunched over my desk, the only light in the room coming from the glow of my laptop screen. Suddenly, 3 soft but incredibly distinct knocks echoed from my front door. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't have any friends who would show up at this hour, and the main building entrance was supposed to be locked after 11:00 p.m. I sat perfectly still, listening to the silence, hoping it was just a neighbor who had mistaken my door for theirs. I crept toward the hallway and peered through the tiny brass peephole. The hallway light was flickering, casting long, jerky shadows, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty. I let out a shaky breath and returned to my desk, trying to focus on my work. But less than 5 minutes later, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't a soft tap. It was a heavy, aggressive pounding, as if someone was hitting the door with their entire palm. Thud, thud, thud. I bolted to the door and looked through the peephole again. This time, a man was standing there. He was wearing an oversized, filth-stained trench coat, and his hair was a wild, matted mess. He was leaning his forehead against my door, perfectly still, as if he was trying to listen to my heartbeat through the wood. My skin crawled when I noticed his fingers, long and dirty, slowly scratching against the door frame like claws. I found my voice and shouted through the door, "Who is it? What do you want?" The moment I spoke, the scratching stopped. The man went completely rigid. He didn't answer and he didn't move an inch. I looked through the peephole again and my heart nearly stopped. He had turned his head and was now staring directly into the peephole. His eye was wide, bloodshot, and fixed right on mine. It felt like he was looking through the door and straight into my soul. I jumped back, gasping for air. Seconds later, the doorknob began to jiggle. He wasn't just turning it, he was violently wrenching it back and forth, trying to break the lock with pure, frantic strength. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a serrated knife, then immediately dialed 911. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, the violent shaking of the door suddenly stopped. A heavy silence returned to the apartment. I looked toward the floor and saw a small, crumpled piece of yellowed paper being slid under the door. With trembling hands, I picked it up. In jagged, barely legible handwriting, it said, "I know you're in there and I know you're alone. I saw your bathroom window is unlatched." The blood drained from my face. My bathroom opened up into a narrow internal ventilation shaft, a space small enough for a desperate person to climb through. I sprinted toward the bathroom, but I was already too late. The small window was wide open and the cold night air was rushing in. On the tile floor were wet, muddy footprints leading out of the bathroom and straight into my dark bedroom. The intruder was already inside my home. I turned to run for the front door, but a shadow stepped out from the bedroom. It was him. He was standing there with a crazed, toothless grin, holding a rusted iron rod he must have pulled from the stairwell. Just as he took a step toward me, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. The flashing blue lights reflected off my walls. Terrified by the sound, the man turned, scrambled back into the bathroom, and vanished through the window into the dark shaft. The police searched the entire block, but the man was never found. They discovered that he had been living in the crawl space of the building for weeks, watching the residents through the vents. They found a collection of items he had stolen from other apartments, along with dozens of notes similar to the one he gave me. I moved out the very next morning and never looked back. To this day, whenever I hear the sound of a rusted stair creaking or a soft scratch on a door, I am transported back to that night. I learned that locks only protect you if you remember to check every single window, because some people aren't looking for a way in, they are waiting for you to leave a way in for them.